Hey everyone, you're listening to The Momentum Project, where Rui Castillo and I, George Berger, discuss strategies to achieve momentum in finance, startups, venture capital, and with an emerging market perspective sprinkled on top. If you like discussions on markets, startup ideas, and business trends in general, you'll enjoy the show. And today, we'll talk about podcasts in Mexico, where Amazon Music is making some really big moves. And Rui is going to talk about the risks of starting a company in Latin America and why more entrepreneurs should consider leveraged buyouts.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
All right, let's get started. Rui, who do you consider Mexico's biggest podcaster?
From a business perspective, Rodrigo Pacheco, have you heard about him? He's like one of the main voices related to business in Mexico. Mm-hmm. I think that he's like the big guy right now. What do you think about that?
And just in terms of listener numbers, did you like ever check out like the charts, like which is the most popular podcast in Mexico?
No, I don't know who has it. Like
so I think there's one which is called Se Regalan Dudas. Have you heard of this one?
Yeah, I have heard about it.
I don't know the name of the two co-hosts. It's basically a podcast focused on like a female audience. I would say it's like relationship advice, career advice, life advice in general, kind of like that. But then I think the other podcaster who I consider like the biggest in terms of just pure listener numbers is Roberto Martinez.
Interesting. Yeah, he's a big guy too.
Yeah, so Roberto Martinez, he does like interviews with like artists, creative. He has a podcast called Creativo, which is like The Creative. And there was some pretty big news actually because Amazon Music signed an exclusive deal with him. So he's going to be available exclusively on Amazon Music. And I had actually never heard of Amazon Music before. I'd never used it. So let me paint you a picture of how big Roberto Martinez is. He, apart from being like always in the top 3 podcasters charts in Mexico, he has 2.2 million subscribers on YouTube. So I think that kind of differentiates him from other podcasters who only have a strong podcast audience. He's also really, really big on YouTube. So he has 2.2 million subscribers on YouTube. From his last 5 episodes, he had 300,000 views, 500,000 views, 700,000 views, 280,000 views, and then 1 million views was an interview with Luis Gerardo Mendez, the actor, the Mexican actor. Okay. And some other sort of big episodes that he had on YouTube was with Santa Fe Clan, who's a Mexican rapper, 4.8 million. Luisito Comunica, famous Mexican YouTuber, has 2.3 million. And these are like 1 to 2 hour interviews. So he's getting around like 1 million views per episode on YouTube. Just to put this into perspective, the last 5 clips on the Joe Rogan channel had 1.5 million views, 400,000, 700,000, 300,000, and 800,000. So those were the last clips. Obviously, Joe Rogan now exclusively publishes his podcast on Spotify, and he does have like several episodes with like 10 million, 15 million, 20 million. But this should give you a perspective on how big Roberto Martinez is. Like he's getting like 1 million views on a 2-hour conversation quite regularly. And then he's also getting millions of downloads. So he's always like either number 1 or number 2 or number 3 in the podcast charts in Mexico.
That's so crazy. And he's a Spanish-speaking podcast, right? Like all of his content is in Spanish. So
exactly. So I want you to guess the size of the deal. It's not public information. I just want you to estimate. Like the Joe Rogan deal was 100 million. So what do you think? How much do you think Amazon Music paid Roberto Martinez?
I don't know, maybe something around 10 million, 5 million.
Yeah. I wrote down 10 to 20 million. And I think 20 million would be kind of like at the higher end. It's probably going to be paid out over several years. Yeah. So it's massive. It's amazing. It's a massive deal. Yeah, it's a crazy deal because I think that most Americans probably don't think that podcasts are, or have probably never heard of any podcasters outside of the US. So podcasts are really, really big in Latin America. And I wanted to kind of give some numbers to provide like context on how big podcasts are outside of the US. But I also wanted to discuss this deal because it's very, very interesting. And I really like the way it's structured. because his podcast episodes are going to be exclusive on Amazon Music, and you'll have to be a subscriber, so you'll have to pay a monthly fee to Amazon in order to listen to his episodes. And Amazon basically went for the biggest podcaster in Mexico, like to start this podcasting strategy. And what I really like about this deal is that Roberto Martinez is still allowed to upload on YouTube. Like, he's still allowed to upload entire episodes on YouTube. But they are going to be delayed for 3 days. So if you're a subscriber to Amazon Music, you'll get the episodes 3 days before they're uploaded to YouTube. And I think that's a fantastic deal because he knows the value of YouTube, because I think until now it's been his only monetization strategy apart from selling books and stuff like that. So he's still allowed to upload complete episodes. And this is different from the Joe Rogan deal, because Joe Rogan is only allowed to do clips on YouTube. And Spotify actually had to roll out like a video solution in order to allow Joe Rogan to not only post episodes, but also video to Spotify. But I love that Roberto Martinez basically negotiated in a way that he's still allowed to upload.
That way
YouTube.
he diversifies also his sources of income. I think that's, when they get this contract where it's like some sort of monopoly with just one company or one platform, I think it's risky too. So yeah, I think that's something big for him to be able to upload videos in YouTube. That's huge.
Yeah, and I think it's this deal is generally pretty good news for creators, right? Because it's so difficult to monetize a podcast. So to have like a big player like Amazon Music come in, I'm really looking forward to sort of the podcast wars that are going to start happening between Amazon Music and Spotify. I think Spotify is just so dominant in the US. I think in emerging markets it's going to look quite different, or could look quite different. So I'm really looking forward to see how that is going to pan out. And I think that Roberto Martinez could eventually also be available on Prime, like on Amazon on Prime Video, potentially. And the other reason why I think this deal is so interesting is that it's backed by data. Right, Amazon has the best data in the world. They understand the customers, I think, better than anyone else. And a lot of their audience, or a lot of their customers, are willing to pay a subscription for Amazon Music. And probably they even know that they are specifically willing to pay to hear content from Roberto Martinez. I think that they probably have some data around possibly books being sold or other merchandise, etc. So I think it's probably a deal that Amazon is using data to underwrite it, and I think it's a really, really smart move, and it paints a general picture on how big podcasts are in Latin America, right? Because Amazon wouldn't do $1 million deal if the numbers aren't there to support that type of deal, right? If it wouldn't make financial sense. So I think it kind of paints a picture on how big podcasts are in Mexico and in Latin America in general. And this got me started thinking about podcasts outside of the US. So I did a little bit of research, and the two countries that are actually that have the highest per minute consumption of podcasts per capita are Korea and Spain. And
Korea and Spain, wow,
yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. And then Brazil has a higher percentage of podcast listeners than the US. And guess what percentage of Mexicans have listened to a podcast in the last 90 days?
I don't know, less than 10%?
No, it's like 30%. So it's like
wow,
34,
really?
Yeah, 34 million Mexicans approximately, or like a little bit more, maybe like 40 million. So it's a pretty big market, and it's maybe like a little bit unexpected that there are so many podcast listeners.
You know, something that I was thinking about the podcast industry in general, when I was younger, like early 90s, like we used to hear the radio, like radio programs when we were driving, or like my parents were driving. Like that was what you listened to. And then you had like, cassettes and CDs, and you could like listen to something. But if you wanted like something which was streaming, of course that was radio. And it was a huge market. Like most people driving were listening to the local radio or whatever. And I think now with like, podcasts, that it's somehow helping to move from that radio industry to the podcasting industry in a really interesting way. Because of course it's the same business model as Netflix. You can choose what you want to hear, right? Instead of the like radio broadcasting company just putting out content and telling you, okay, if you want to listen to us, this will be the program, right? I think that power is really interesting. So in some way, it makes sense to me that a large percentage of the population is listening to podcasts. Really interesting.
Yeah, and I think probably that most advertisers underestimate how many podcast listeners there are in Mexico and in Latin America in general. So because on the radio, it's so many ads all the time, and I think that radio is still pretty lucrative. And it's still a big deal. Like if you're on the radio in Latin America, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Like people will write to you like, "Oh, I listened to like your interview." Like I think that listening to radio is still much bigger in Mexico than it is in the US, I would say.
Yes.
And the one thing that's interesting is how advertising dollars are potentially going to shift from radio to podcasters, because that has already happened in the US to some extent, and I think that it's definitely lagging behind a lot in Mexico, but it's starting. Like I know of podcasts with advertising, but it's still pretty tough to monetize as a podcaster. So go ahead.
Yeah, like in your research, did you find anything about Dimes y Billetes with Maurice Dieck?
I'm aware of that podcast, but go ahead. What's your idea?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know how big it is right now. I think related to personal finance, it is by far the largest podcast in Mexico. I think Maurice Dieck is friends with Roberto Martinez. All of them. It's really interesting. I think that Monterrey, Mexico, has a pretty strong podcasting community. I don't know why it's happening there. I don't know if it's related to being closer to the US. Monterrey is a really dynamic city in terms of economics and really like there is like a strong entrepreneurship culture in Monterrey compared to other cities or regions in Mexico. But the interesting thing is that all of these podcasts that you have been mentioning, they are pretty new. And lots of them come from people in Monterrey, which is also interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I've noticed that as well. And in general, I think a lot of new media companies are originating from Monterrey. So there are also like a bunch of newsletters that are written from like small media startups in Monterrey, like business newsletters, and they're like a subscription. They monetize via subscription. So I think that Monterrey is slowly but surely establishing itself as like a new media hub, or like a hub for new media companies. So I think that they are currently there working on figuring out how to monetize these like new media companies, and also how to monetize just podcasts in general. And I wouldn't be surprised if we will see some sort of new age media companies coming out of Monterrey, because that sort of media, that entrepreneurial media ecosystem in Monterrey seems to be growing really, really quickly. And but I still think that it's really, really tough to monetize as a podcaster in Mexico. And I was kind of like brainstorming different ideas, and I think that there are two broad ideas that I have that could work, but they're kind of opposed to one another. So they're kind of like they could still coexist, but are technically betting against each other. And so I'll quickly tell you about those two ideas, and you can tell me what you think. So first, I quickly want to sort of explain the problem, because I see like a lot of creator economy startups that are doing something along the lines of like helping creators getting paid, like with different tools to collect payments and stuff like that. And I don't think that collecting payments is actually the problem. Because we already have PayPal, Stripe, all the local payment solutions, OpenPay, Connecta, etc. And you can just drop a link and ask for a subscription or for a payment. So I don't think that the actual process of getting paid is the problem. What I do think is the problem is monetization, which is not the same as getting paid. So the challenge is to convert users or listeners to customers, people that give you money. The infrastructure of that already exists. So it's not about actually collecting payments. It's creating some kind of scenario where you can basically have an easy way to monetize your audience, your listeners, in a variety of different ways. So I think, and in general, there are three different ways, right? There's micropayments, there's subscriptions, and there is some kind of solution that scales monetization via ads. So those are the three ways to monetize. And I think that one interesting play would be to create a media company focused on podcast production, similar to Gimlet Media. So Gimlet Media for LatAm would be a really, really good idea. Are you familiar with Gimlet Media?
No, not really.
Yeah, so Gimlet Media was this media company that produced dozens and dozens of different podcasts, and they were ultimately acquired by Spotify 3 years ago for around, I think it was $280 million or something like that. There's another big podcast production company called Wondery. You might have heard this podcast called Business Wars. Yeah.
Yes, I know Wondery. Yeah,
so
they have lots of content.
So it's
huge.
Highly produced, right? It's not like your regular podcast where it's just an interview or something like that. It's highly produced content. And so I think that something like that could work. Sort of a media company that focuses on monetizing podcasts, where you could just do a collective of different talents and you roll that up. And I think it's a unique opportunity to do that because monetization is so difficult. So if you just create a company around that where you produce the content, you sort of pay creators on a monthly basis, and you take care of monetization. So you have a sales team, and that sales team helps sell ads. You do cross promotion. You figure out a few different ways to monetize, right? So you create a company, you recruit talent, and then you sort out monetization for those podcasters. I think that a very, very successful media company in Latin America could be born out of this idea. And this idea essentially banks on monetization continuing to being really, really difficult, right? Because if you're a huge podcaster, you have very, very limited options to monetize. You kind of need a bigger corporate structure that helps you monetize. So I think a Gimlet Media for Latin America could be a really, really interesting opportunity. And then the other one would simply be a different podcast app. So a few years ago, I was using this app called The Podcast App, which I don't know if you ever used it, but it was a very, very clean app. I really liked it. It was a startup that I think was actually backed by Y Combinator, and it was from a bunch of founders from Argentina, and it's basically an app completely focused on podcasts. And I think that there's an interesting opportunity there. So I think that given the numbers in Latin America, you probably could create a Spotify competitor and try to convince creators to also use your app. You could potentially do something similar to Anchor, where you upload the episode and it then gets distributed to all platforms, including yours, and then you automate ads. So automatically ads will play on your app. And I think that there's a window of opportunity to do this for Latin America, because Spotify is now doing this. So if you are, and they're doing it only in the US. So they're not yet doing this in Latin America. But I think that there's this window of opportunity to basically create a Spotify competitor completely focused on podcasts, where you automate monetization where via ads. So where ads just start playing every now and then in like specific moments during the episode, and then creators get paid. So they can just sort of click, I want to start monetizing, and I think that could be a good opportunity, like to basically have an app that natively has options to do micropayments for episodes, to do subscriptions, to maybe have like exclusive content via subscriptions, to have automated ads, but all that could be natively integrated in the app. So if you ask me, the founders of the podcast app should just give it another shot and just like create a startup around this idea and help podcasters in Latin America monetize. I think that there's a window of opportunity, specifically because podcasts on Spotify are also not that great, in my opinion. I don't know what you feel about the experience of listening to podcasts on Spotify. But
are you talking like Mexican podcasts, like or,
I think
general?
I think the way I would start is start in LatAm and then go global. So you could try to figure out how to create monetization strategies natively in your app for Latin American creators, and then you go global eventually, and then you get acquired by Spotify.
I agree. I think that so a bunch of times I have tried to listen to Mexican podcasts through Spotify. I love history. I really like business podcasts, like finance, news podcasts. And what I have found is that lots of them, the best part about those podcasts, George, is their intro, the music they start with. Like, quality is still lagging a lot, I think that returning to your two ideas, any sort of business or platform that helps content creators to professionalize, if that's the proper word, to how, like, I think that one of the main problems right now is that a lot of content creators, like people that are doing podcasts, I don't know if they don't have the resources, the expertise, they are doing these, like, very, very, in their homes, in their garage, right? Like, I think they're still lagging behind in terms of quality, in the production. So having this kind of business model that creates an ecosystem and then helps content creators to overcome these barriers, I think that could be like awesome, like a wonderful way to make this happen, because I think it's related to that. So I think
so. Gimlet Media for Latin America is
yes,
what you would go for.
Yes, I agree. Mm-hmm. I will definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Let's go to the next topic.
Leveraged buyouts. Okay. So my question to you, George. Have you ever heard about leveraged buyouts?
I'm like slightly familiar with the topic. So you take out a credit to acquire a business. So it requires a bunch of financial analysis, but I really don't know the details.
Okay, so let's keep it simple. But basically it's, let's say that you are a company, right? So you are an operating business and you identify an opportunity to buy another company, which is like preferably it has some sort of relation with what you do as a company. But what you try to do is making this very careful financial analysis. The main goal is to understand if there is an opportunity to use credit. So you use credit to buy this new company, and the cash flows that this new company is producing will cover those financial expenses or those credit expenses, right? So what's really interesting is that this is much easier with companies that have a good amount of assets, right? So if you have property, if that new company has property, machinery, valuable assets, that makes it way easier because you can use those assets as collateral, right? And I think one of the main issues with leveraged buyouts is the financial cost, the interest rate, what are the terms of that financing that you're going to get to buy the company. So to try to make it more understandable for our listeners, lots of people in Mexico and Latin America, they have this very common idea that you could buy a house, right, using a mortgage, using credit. So the idea is, okay, if I can make a 10% or 20% down payment, let's say it's a $100,000 US dollars property, I can make a down payment of $20,000 and then I'll use 20 years or 30 years. Well, to be honest, it's really, really difficult to find a 30-year mortgage in Latin America. Most of them go up to 20 years. But let's say that you can get enough capital to make the exact down payment in such a way that the mortgage that you get is paid through the rent. So you rent that property. So the idea is that the cash flow that your business, when you think about the leverage buyout, the idea is that you find a business which is successful enough so that the rate of return that it produces and the free cash flow that you get is able to cover those financing costs. And at the end, you will end with that company, right? And of course, you can think in terms of, okay, what happens if we have some sort of vertical integration, or if we can do some sort of economies of scale. Lots of topics can be discussed related to this. But why am I bringing the leverage buyout topic today? Because as this is an entrepreneurship podcast, something that I think is really, really important to discuss is how risky is it to be an entrepreneur? And that's something that I want to ask you, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your experience as an entrepreneur. The question, George, is it worth it to be an entrepreneur?
Well, statistically speaking, obviously not, right? Because I think that the general statistic there is that 90% of startups fail. I think that there are a bunch of different ways to manage your risk. Like you can just do proper opportunity analysis. You can do an MVP to validate customer demand. So I think that there are a lot of different strategies in order to become an entrepreneur in a way where you manage the risk appropriately. Yeah. So I don't think that, obviously you shouldn't just start a company because you have a good idea, right? You should first think about analyzing the opportunity, maybe validating it. There are a lot of different strategies to manage your risk. And I think that the potential upside definitely makes it worth it. So
of course, yeah.
My answer would be yes. If you manage your risk, if you approach entrepreneurship in a systematic way, I think it's definitely worth it. So that's my answer.
Yeah, I think it's great, and I totally agree. I think it's all related to risk management. I mean, we know that if we want to get results and we want to get returns in any aspect of our lives, we need to take risks. But as we know in the business arena, it's you can take stupid risks without conscience of what you're deciding, and you can have a proper risk management strategy. So as I'm the guy here who is more focused on the personal finance or the finance side of things, I want to tell you about Alexa Fontobel. I don't know if you have heard about that. She has the first time I heard about her was in a TED Talk. So she's a CFP, a certified financial planner in the US, and she wanted to she created LearnBest. So basically it's a platform that allows financial planners it's a financial planners marketplace. Really interesting. The US is way ahead of compared to Latin America in terms of financial advice. I'll discuss that in another podcast. But like we here in Mexico, we are like in 1990. Like Mexico right now, in terms of financial advice, is like the US in the 1990s.
Like in terms of market penetration, or
yeah, the number of financial advisors, how developed the financial advice services on the industry is developed. Like we are way behind, and probably Mexico is like compared to Brazil, we are like Brazil in 2010.
Okay,
so
yeah. Brazil's ahead as well.
Yeah, but probably we are going to see like an explosion in the financial advice industry here in Mexico. But I'm sorry, just going back to the main topic. So Alexa Fontobel once wrote this really interesting article about, okay, do you want to be an entrepreneur? Fine. Yeah, there are lots of financial risks. If you're in Mexico, 3 out of 4 companies, like 75% of the new companies disappear after 2 years, George. Like, so yeah, that's crazy. You mentioned 90% of entrepreneurs fail.
I think it's 90% in 5 years, right?
In 5 years, yeah, it's crazy. So, how can you like plan this risk management? So the first thing that I'll say is that I think the way to go, and I'm quoting again Alexa Fontobel, is that you should think about having some sort of emergency fund. Like, what you want to avoid is that trying to start up a business results in damaging your personal finances so strongly or so harsh that it will take you years. Like, let's imagine like you start a business. You dream that it's going to be really successful. You put in the work. You find some money from friends and family, maybe some loans, and it doesn't work. And after 3 or 4 years, you don't have any money. You need to declare bankruptcy. And if you weren't careful, those loans will be something that you will have to pay. Those loans will be at your name, and you will be responsible for paying them, and like those your creditors will go after your properties or whatever you have, your assets. So of course, like a lot of this risk management tool starts with, okay, you need to use maybe some sort of company that protects you somehow for certain liabilities. But Alexa Fontobel starts with a very basic principle. She says, okay, we know that one of the most powerful financial tools for people is an emergency fund. And it sounds like really poetic, but an emergency fund is basically having low cost cash, like access to low cost liquidity, right? Mm-hmm. And she said something which I found really interesting. So most people, like most financial advisors, will tell you that you need to have a 3 months of expenses as a emergency fund. So if you need $10,000 per month to live, you need $30K, right? So she says that if you want to start a business, if you want to move from being a corporate employee and start your own business, she recommends having at least 9 months of your expenses, or of your living expenses, as an emergency fund, which is crazy, George. Like it's a large amount of money,
Yeah.
And to be honest, after reading that article, my first thought was like, this is like too much. Like I can imagine that most of the greatest companies that are operating today wouldn't be here if those founders waited until they had 9 months of living expenses saved in their cash account, right?
Yeah, I think you can also approach this differently. I think that you can continue to have your job and just start a startup on the side. That's how I would approach it. I think it's very difficult, right? I think it's very difficult to create a buffer of 9 months of savings. The way I would approach it is start a business on the side, work in the evenings, and see how it goes. And then once you have an investor, you go all in. That's how I would approach it, and that would be my number one risk management strategy if you're starting as an entrepreneur.
George, do you know which is like this is what like failed businesses, failed entrepreneurs answer when they were asked what was the main reason for your business failing. What do you think was their answer? Like
it's running out of money.
Top one. Yeah, basically, like not enough income, like the cash flow was not enough, right?
Of course.
So this, I think it's really interesting, George, because I think that I remember going to this Carlos Casuga conference. Carlos Casuga, I don't know if he's still alive. He's like a 90-something-year-old Japanese, Mexican Japanese. He's from Japanese parents. He brought Yakult to Mexico. Like Yakult is like, I don't know, like probably you can describe it better than me. This
it's like this little milk drink. Yeah, fermented. I don't know how they made that, but so he in that conference he mentioned that Japan has like a very strong philosophy, like business culture, that basically they see companies as humans. So the way he was like trying to explain this is, could you ask your 5-year-old baby to maintain yourselves economically? Like let's say that you're a parent and you have a 5-year-old. Could you ask your 5-year-old to like pay all your expenses like what you need to live? Of course not. So he said that like Japanese companies try to reinvest like their profits for a long term until they start to pay dividends, because they see those companies as child. So something that I can connect what you just said about like having a side hustle, starting a business on the side while you keep your job and you keep earning your salary, or going the way, if you're someone super organized and you're able to build 9 or 10 months worth of expenses, okay. But the main goal, I think, is to be able to not have financial pressure for your business right away. So if you start a company and right away you need to take cash out to pay for traveling or your high rent or whatever, I think that's what at the end explains a lot of the financial trouble for new businesses, because somehow entrepreneurs start a business, they have this level of, they have a level of quality of life, a level of expenses, and they want to keep that, and that creates a huge financial pressure for their startups. So I prefer what you said. I think that lots of entrepreneurs could start with a side hustle, like, I'm gonna work until 10, 11 p.m. because my job is from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and I want to make this happen. Of course.
And yeah, so you have to make that sacrifice in time, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's crucial until you get to the point where you can have more investors or some sort of financing, that you by yourself as an entrepreneur find a way to keep that financial pressure out of your baby business, right?
Yeah, and I think that that we kind of need to differentiate between entrepreneurs that are pursuing business models that have already been validated, and then entrepreneurs that are potentially trying to do something very, very innovative, where there are a lot more sort of unknown variables, where you're trying to do something new and you don't actually know if the business model, if it can be a sustainable business model. So one of the things that you mentioned is leverage buyouts. So, looking at a company, looking to potentially take out a credit and acquire a company. You mentioned that companies do this quite frequently. Can individuals also do leverage buyouts of, let's say, smaller companies? And how would you as an individual approach that? Because if you can look at like the historic financial data of a company, you can evaluate if it's feasible, and you've already, it's obviously very good from a risk management perspective, because you've already validated that there's a market, that there are customers that want to buy this. Because I think a lot of startups like actually die because they never manage to sell anything, right? So I think that's why a lot of startups fail. And then the other category of failures is basically that there's no sustainable business model, so that they sell but there's no profit margins, right? So I think those are the two kind of failure categories that you have. But
Yes.
if you do a leveraged buyout of a startup, you can look at financial data, how they've performed historically, and take out a credit and then buy that startup. So do you know of any individuals that are doing this? And do you think that that's a realistic option to potentially become an entrepreneur, like just to take out a credit, buy a company? Do you think that that would be a smart idea?
Yes, I mean, I think of course, it has risk, as everything has. So to answer your first question, yes, there is people doing leveraged buyouts with small companies. So the idea here is that it's way more difficult to do it with a startup because like a startup has probably not much historical like data.
Let's say a company that's like 2 or 3 years old. They'll already have
Yes.
revenue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you have, it's just as example that I gave with the property. If you have a rental property and the cash flow, the monthly rent, the cap rate is enough to pay for the financial cost, okay, you can do it. The property will pay for acquiring that asset, that rental house or whatever. So the same happens with small businesses. Because something which is interesting, George, is that lots of small and medium companies, some of them can have like really good margins. Like rates of returns can be much more higher than, let's say, a property, right? Risk is also much higher. But if you have evidence that it's possible to keep those margins, that revenue, that free cash flow. Of course, now the tricky side here, and I think it's much more riskier to do that right now in 2022, at the end of 2022 compared to 2021, is that financial cost is a key element in these leverage buyouts. If you have, and that's probably the main problem with Latin America. So right now in the US, the interest rates have been rising quite steadily thanks to the Federal Reserve. They made an increase of 75 basis points yesterday, so it's closer now to 4%. So you have the mortgage rates, just as an indicator, at 7% in the US, like really high compared to the last decade. And here in Mexico, we have like the free risk interest rate, the one that Banco de Mexico, states at 10 and 11%, like if you're investing in CETES, in 1 year government bonds. So yeah, it's the financial cost right now with the current interest rates. I think it makes it much more difficult in this current moment. However, still, I think that you need to so you mentioned validated business models. I think that there is a huge opportunity with the generational transition or world transition. Maybe you have heard that concept. Like lots of baby boomers are really close to retirement, and lots of baby boomers do not have someone in their family who wants to keep the business.
Yep.
So I was reading an article about this. Like, there's going to be like a huge opportunity to buy successful businesses that they have been operating for 5, 10, 20 years, that they have, good market shares. And these are small and medium businesses that are located maybe, in one city. But they are a good opportunity to buy. And those are already, working businesses. They are successful in their way. And I'll just add that maybe instead of like bringing an idea from zero, from scratch, I think that there is always space to innovate, to look for innovation in an already established business, in an already running company. I remember my oldest brother once went to. Do you remember? Is it Y Combinator where Dropbox was incubated?
Yeah.
Okay, so he went there when he was studying his MBA. This is like 10 years ago. And he went to a conference with I don't know, I think he was the owner of Tetra Pak, like the milk containers.
Yeah.
And basically what he said, that guy mentioned in that conference, is that, you stop trying to find like great ideas. Like there are lots of already good and working ideas out there. Just find a way to use technology to make that business or that idea work better. Either by, reducing costs or making the consumer experience much better. Like just find something which is already working and try to bring technology to it and make it better that way. So I think that lots of, wannabe entrepreneurs should look for those kind of strategies. And I think that a huge opportunity is coming in the next years with all those baby boomers, like, those businesswomen, businessmen that are gonna like retire and they will be probably happy to sell their businesses.
Yeah. It sounds like a very interesting trend that probably is going to create like a lot of, I think there will probably be a lot of like new private equity firms that are going to form around that trend and just buy up traditional businesses. And we'll probably see a similar trend here in Mexico as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I will advise a lot of people who want to stop working as employees and they want to be business owners to go that way.
And I think that we should wrap it up. We're at like almost 50 minutes now. So we wanted to do like a 40-minute or like a 30 to 40-minute episode. So if you like the show, tune in and we'll see you and hear you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.